Hello and welcome to Talking Europe. I'm Armand Georgian at the European Development Days in Brussels. This is one of the biggest development conferences in Europe, attracting decision makers and high-profile speakers from all over the world. Since the annual event was launched in 2006, it's grown into what some have called the Davos of Development. And like Davos, it's hard to measure tangible outcomes. But clearly, in terms of sharing ideas and contacts, it's a very important event in the calendar, both for policymakers and for the aid and development community. Well, this year's theme is Women and Girls at the Forefront of Sustainable Development. So to explore that topic and related issues, I'm joined by three guests. First of all, Winnie Byanyima, the Director General of Oxfam International. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
Also joining me, Deng Deng Hochiai is the Education Minister of South Sudan, which became an independent state in July 2011, so almost exactly 7 years ago. Welcome to you, Minister.
Thank you.
And last but not least, in fact, a veteran of our debates and of the European Parliament, I have to say, Charles Goerens, a leading figure on development issues at the European Parliament. He's a member of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe and the author of a report towards an EU external strategy against early and forced marriages, which is, of course, very topical here. Welcome to you, Charles. Winnie, if I could start with you. We've seen this year, ahead of these development days, a convergence, an interesting blend of things. On the one hand, warnings from the World Bank about the rising costs of gender inequality, the economic penalties that countries pay for not giving women equal rights. We've also had, though, a coming together of movements like Me Too and Time's Up. What do you make of this blend, and what does it all amount to?
Well, first, I think there is a seismic shift in norm globally, that women have risen, starting in Hollywood, to say that we will not take abuse in the workplace. That is a huge shift going through all sectors, including ours, the development and humanitarian sector. But secondly, there's more awareness. Evidence has been adduced over many years that not only are women's rights human rights, but that when you realize women's rights, there are benefits for economies and for societies, for everybody. I think that is coming together to create some change and some more focus and some more resources going and political will to address women's rights.
Are you sensing a sea change, Charles Goerens?
As far as gender equality is concerned, yes, there is a change. Well, we have been so many people activists as well as institutional actors to promote the gender equality. It has been laid down in the Sustainable Development Goals and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The guiding principles of the development policy.
How important are these goals to your country, to South Sudan?
Very important. In fact, we have prioritized gender equality in our constitution. Women have been given 25% of all government positions, including positions in the executive, the judiciary, the national and state parliaments. So we have achieved a good progress since
25%.
25%. In fact, our national parliament has 35% women representation, including a deputy speaker. We have also in the cabinet at least 25% of the cabinet are women. In education, we have been struggling. But with the support of the UK government, we have made significant progress. According to the data released on Monday, this Monday, we have 1.6 million children in our schools. 48% is girls. So That's good, really good news for us.
Right. I mean, there's obviously, as a journalist, I have to mention some less good news as well. It's sort of my job. But okay. There was a report I'm sure you're aware of from the International Rescue Committee in George Washington University from November 2017, which talked about the shocking scale of violence against women in South Sudan, double the global average, according to this report, and that obviously follows the UN Commission on Human Rights, which mentioned in December 2016 the scale of rape of women and girls in the South Sudanese war perpetrated by all armed groups is mind-boggling, according to the Commission on Human Rights back then. So there are some pretty huge problems. I'm wondering how you're going to address those and get accountability for the perpetrators.
Sexual violence is a byproduct of the war, and we want to address the issue of the conflict, make sure that we silence the guns, and we are working very hard to conclude a revitalized agreement as soon as we can. Our president is very committed. Many in the leadership of the country are very committed. So we want to tackle the issue, and this is why we produce an action plan to tackle the issue of sexual violence in the country. But it is actually blown out of proportion. You know, if you are South Sudanese, you would tell that it is not that big, you know, as it is, you know, reported in that report.
Reactions to that?
I would respectfully disagree. Last year I was in Malakal, a town in South Sudan. I met women, I sat with them. They told me that they have a choice between staying in the camps, protected people's camps, and starving, or stepping out to go to the town to look for food and getting raped. I met other women who told me that in their whole villages that soldiers came, soldiers or rebels, armed people came, raped every woman there. And let's be clear that even war has laws. There are laws of war. You cannot perpetrate such crimes against women in war. Those are crimes that should be, you know, punished by the most severe laws, such as the International Criminal Court. I think that it should come to the attention of the whole world, and leaders on all sides should be held accountable for women's lives in that country.
Charles, any thoughts about the situation in South Sudan, as we have a minister here?
Well, it's a specific problem, but nevertheless, it's a widespread problem. As you know, we have in today's international behavior, another kind of conflicts. They are no longer, for most of them, international conflicts, but intranational conflicts. The conflicts are developing within the borders of a country. And the root causes of that is poverty. Poverty, and as long as we cannot eliminate this, we are not able to overcome the situation. We have to act on two levels. First, or three levels. When a military intervention is not wanted or is not appropriate, then we have to act, first of all, on a humanitarian basis, and in the longer run, develop projects, programs, perhaps budgetary aid, where we can channel our aid through the budget of the recipient country. But some preliminary conditions has to be fulfilled before implementing the whole range of means I've been mentioning.
Just a quick reaction from you.
Yes. We are talking about sexual violence in conflict contexts, but if we talk broadly about violence against women and girls, this cuts across all divisions, rich and poor countries, north and south, conflict and stable states. Women all over the world and girls suffer violence in the home, at work, on the streets, everywhere. And this is now seen as really a scourge of, it's a stain on our humanity, and we need to address it all over the world.
I'd like to just change gear now because I do want to look at the situation in Europe as it relates to EU development policy towards Africa. And of course, there is a change of political climate, I suppose one could say, in Europe with a new government in Italy, which has a new interior minister that's promising to reduce migrant arrivals and speed up deportations. So what does all this mean for the EU's relations with African countries and on any potential generosity in actually dispersing promised aid for various EU programs and joint programs with the UN? Let's take a look first at those recent developments I mentioned in Italy.
An end to Sicily as the refugee camp of Europe. That was Matteo Salvini's vow as he toured the island. Italy's newly sworn-in interior minister was drumming up support for his far-right La Lega party ahead of municipal elections and pushing a harder line on immigration. The port of Pozzallo is one of the so-called hotspots which rapidly processes migrants arriving from Africa as part of the EU's relocation procedure. Salvini called for a rapid escalation of deportations.
We must open deportation centres in each region, making stronger agreements with countries of origin, and above all, renegotiate Italy's role in Europe.
Salvini has said he'd end what he called, quote, good times for illegals, angering refugee advocates.
Migrants arrive here to disastrous conditions, and they do not have the right to be nursed. There are a lot of mistakes in the care of vulnerable migrants. We cannot talk about good times.
La Lega and populist coalition partner Five Star have called for more help from the EU to deal with the wave of migrants, the brunt of which has been borne by Greece and Italy. A controversial agreement between Italy's former government and Libyan authorities and militias meant a 75% drop in migrant arrivals since the summer of 2017. To fund more deportation centres, Salvini wants to reallocate the country's annual budget for migrants, most of which currently goes to reception centres. As Italy's new government gets to work, a major sticking point with the EU is the issue of asylum seekers filing their claim in the first EU country they enter. The so-called Dublin rule has weighed heavily on Italy, where over 700,000 migrants have arrived since 2013. EU interior ministers failed to make progress on the Dublin rule at a meeting on June 5th.
So, Minister Denye, when you see those images, what do you think all this means for your country, for South Sudan and its relations with the European Union? Do you see a kind of fortress Europe developing?
I think there is something fundamental about the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention was not a piece of law that just, appeared of a sudden. It was justifiable at the time. It is still justifiable and relevant at this time. We owe, our fellow human beings, our services, including protecting them. So we need to uphold the law. But unless there's something fundamental wrong with the law in that case.
Yeah, but how does one uphold the law when you see that there is a focus on security rather than on long-term development? And it's not just from Matteo Salvini, the Interior Minister of Italy. Even Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission, in his State of the Union speech, effectively put the emphasis on security, the security of Europe, and managing migration rather than on long-term development. What do you think about all this?
I think it is shameful, and I want now to agree very much with the minister from South Sudan, that these European countries, rich countries, were at the forefront of making international humanitarian law, human rights law, refugee law. They led the world to make these laws. They can't be the ones now walking back on those same laws. It is shameful. They are so rich. Look, a country like Lebanon, poor, middle-income country, now has 1/4 of its population are refugees from Syria. They are not screaming, they are not crying, they are absorbing this, they are sharing their poor schools and their poor clinics with those people who have run away from danger. And Europe, rich, cannot share their rich classrooms and their rich hospitals with fleeing people. It breaks my heart to see these young Africans drowning in the Mediterranean on the shores of rich Europe. It breaks my heart.
I hear what you're saying. I just want to get one final point from you, Charles Goerens, about when you look at all this from the European Parliament, do you see that there's a question of realpolitik here because the EU is renegotiating its financial framework? It's going to be hit by Britain's departure from the EU. Plugging that hole is going to be the paramount concern, and perhaps longer-term issues, long-term investment in aid, literacy, numeracy in Africa is going to suffer, isn't it?
Yes, security is an important item on the agenda, but insecurity is the follow-up of poverty and hopeless situations. That's the reason why we have to act on several layers. One is the humanitarian, the second layer is defense or security cooperations with our partners in Africa. Third is a long-lasting strategy, implementation of a strategy, a well-conceived strategy in order to allow our partner countries to overcome the poverty. But that cannot happen in 1 year. Huh? That's a long-lasting effort, but we have to deal and to tackle so many problems at the same time.
So we have to look at the origins, the basis of insecurity, rather than just say we need security.
I think that we have to see the rich countries do more than simply say that let's help to tackle the root causes. Let's also not cause problems for those countries that result in wars and displacement.
You're fully right, yes.
We have been pushing hard against the British government, the Conservative government, on its arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the same arms that Yemen is using to kill its people. And meanwhile, they give a little bit of humanitarian assistance and billions in arms sales that fuel the war. So let us also see...
Changing Western foreign policy.
Yeah, but let us also do no harm.
Thank you so much to all my guests. We'll have to go to a short break now, but don't go away because we'll continue this discussion in part 2 of the programme with the EU Commissioner in charge of international cooperation and development and the Director of UN Women.
We are journalists, and normally you have to listen to us, but you have things to tell us too. Maybe you've experienced a dramatic event, or you've got something important to say. You want to make a difference. That is why we created The Observers. Now, the first step is very easy. You get in touch with our team. Send us your images, tell us what you've seen. And then it's our job to get your voice out there, on our site, on social networks, on your mobiles and tablets, and on TV, of course. You can appear in our weekly show via webcam. Or perhaps we'll come see you in person, where you live, in your country, your town, and we'll work together on a report for our investigative show, The Observers Direct. So you get the idea. This show is your show, your way to get your voice out to the world.